Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, darlings. Today, I have a few things to cover first. First of all, my sincerest apologies to Charlotte Emerson. Patreon is acting very weird and she wasn't showing up on my list. She has definitely been a wonderful supporter of me, not just on Patreon, but as a listening ear. And she's awesome. Also, my darlings, if you listen to this and haven't subscribed or rung the little bell, please do so. Apparently, a lot of you are just coming around but not subscribing, and it would really help. Also, hitting the like button is very useful to me. If you guys have any ideas of what you would like to hear, please put them in the comments below. All right. Now on to the story. This one is by Snickering Haystack, shared on my own subreddit, Madame Raven's Darlings, just for me to read to you. The title is, She Said She Was My Father's Sister. I remember it was autumn, early autumn, when the sun is still warm, and there's still a few yellow leaves clinging to the skeletal oak branches. I remember the footpath covered with brown maple leaves and pointed ends curling into crusted spirals. The red sun low in the sky when I passed the gate and saw the woman. I was 9 at the time, 2 months into year 5 in a Surrey primary school, still publicly funded somehow. I wasn't the only black kid in my school, but, as is common in Surrey schools, I was the only black girl in my class. I don't quite know the connection, but for whatever reason, that meant that I was the only one to walk home from school by myself. Don't ask me why it works that way, but that's pretty typical. Elijah, the only black boy in the Bison class, year 4, also walked home without a parent or older sibling. What's sort of funny about it was that both Elijah and I had the farthest to walk out of all of the children. But I digress. I remember saying goodbye to Mrs. McAdoo, who was standing on the school field with 5 other children, waiting for their parents. She waved me goodbye with a small, knowing smile, and I hitched my backpack up on my shoulder and went on my way. I'd made this walk every day after school, around the same time, and I was used to the familiar faces of the parents who would wait behind the school gate. So I immediately noticed the strange woman standing in place, not craning her neck like the other grown-ups, but calmly staring through the bars. At first I thought she was pretty. She was quite striking, I remember, but when I had come within a few feet of her, I saw that she wasn't pretty. More like prettiness had once been reached, but had slipped from her grasp, like morning fog. The most striking thing, setting her apart from all the other grown-ups, was her long dreadlocks, which were graying around the wiry ends. We had held eye contact since I was within 20 feet of the gate, and now I stood before her, looking up into her onyx-colored eyes. "Cadian?" she snapped, in an accent that wasn't Surrey or Cockney, or even Irish like Mrs. McAdoo's. "I'm here to take you home. Come." Hearing it a second time, I realized it was Caribbean, presumably Jamaican. I frowned. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "Never mind that, child. Come, I take you home." "I don't need you to walk me home," I insisted. "We don't walk, we take my car." Irritably, she swiveled around and gestured to a sedan, double parked next to the school's driveway. "Come," she insisted, reaching for my hand. I let her touch me, but then jerked my arm from her grip. I don't need to drive, I insisted. I put one hand on my hip and shifted my weight to that leg, and I don't need a grown-up. I've been walking home by myself since last winter in year 4. Insolent child, she said. Her tone was much sharper than the volume of her voice or the expression on her face. What struck me was how she never seemed to yell or get angry. Her face stayed dead, a mirthless smirk on her lips. Only the color of her eyes waxed hot and cold. Only her tone was corrosive. How do you know me? I asked after a beat. She seemed to laugh, though neither her expression nor body language altered. Come with me, girl. I want to know how you know me. You ask a lot of questions, she said with the faintest hint of amusement. If you can be amused without a sense of humor. Just one, I corrected. She sighed loudly, though her face stayed the same. Then she reached inside her coat, or what I would later learn was called a shawl. It was a multicolored and ruffled. It reminded me of the ponchos I'd seen in those old cowboy movies. Her hand was in there a while, rummaging around, and I remember looking at me like she was trying to make a decision. Then I remember she produced a cigarette. She put it to her lips and lit it, her knotted brown knuckles and long skeletal fingers shielding the lighter's flame. You can't smoke this close to the school, I nagged, knowing how irksome I sounded. Hush, girl, she bit, the unlit cigarette bobbing up and down from her lips. Once lit, she held the cigarette between her long, bony fingers. Then she blew the smoke out of her mouth. The fat white waves speared by 2 long streams from her nostrils, forming a gaseous white dove. I know more than your name, girl, she said with that venomous tone. I know you were born in Croydon on the east side. I know your mother is Miss Farrah Bryce, and your father, Mr. Greg Bryce. I felt frightened then. This was all correct. How did I know this woman? Or more apropos, how did she know me? I'm not supposed to go with strangers, I said to her, a small swelling of pride for remembering what my head teacher and Mrs. McAdoo had told me 1,000 times. To this, the woman gave another mirthless chuckle, but this time I saw a flash of pain in her face as she did it. I'm no stranger, girl, she said quite deliberately. I know you. But I don't know you. The woman took another puff and looked around us. It was only then that I realized. All the other parents had left, leaving only the 2 of us, and the dead leaves, swirling across the footpath, crackling like crumbled paper. I looked behind me and saw the deputy head teacher, Mr. Bearden, at the school entrance talking to a parent. You don't need to know me, I heard the woman say. I'm your kin. What's that? I'm your family. Yeah? How's that? She puffed again, the smoke blowing out her nose like it would from a dragon's. I'm your father's sister. Really? You're my father's sister? I said I was. So you're my aunt? What do you think? How come my father never mentioned you? She gave that laugh again. This time the pain was more evident in her face. You don't believe me? She asked softly. No, I said hurriedly, worried I was being rude, sensing I had somehow hurt her feelings. I believe you. She took a long pull off her smoke, the exhaust seeping in thin wisps from her bottom lip, up to and across her half-masked eyes. She seemed to be sizing me up, her dark pupils cold. You like school? She asked. Her voice had completely changed. Yes, I said, I love school. what you learn. I then rambled on about how Mrs. McAdoo had been teaching us about the ancient Aztecs for history, and how we were also learning about all the creation myths from the Native Americans, and how we made a volcano in science class using plaster and pudding, and how we learned to sing every other week, and how we learned how to put on a Latin dance concert in PE, and etc., etc. She listened, her eyes colored still cool, without interrupting me. She just listened and puffed away. I don't remember how long I ranted on about what I'd learned in school, but I'm sure you can imagine me being a little kid and a bit of a teacher's pet. Her cigarette was now a short, smoldering stub between her yellowing fingers. "Tell me about your mother," she said. "You take care of her?" "Yes," I said, nodding my head feverishly, my braids clicking together. "I take out the garbage every night after supper. My older sister, Kayla, she does the dishes. My baby sister, Anne Mary, she don't do any chores 'cause she's just a baby, see?" There was no chuckle then, just a flash of pain. It soon vanished, and she gave me that humorless smirk before she dropped the butt of her cigarette to the ground and stabbed it out with a sandaled toe. "Okay, child," she said, a hint of hurry in her voice. "Come to the car. Your father asked me to pick you up." To this I froze. I felt my skin prickle. My father was in Paris on a business trip. He'd been in Paris since last Friday. There was no way he had called this woman. "I don't think so," I said. I can walk by myself." She looked at me with that dead expression for what felt like an hour. Then I could not say after how long. She turned a little, still facing me, and began to walk away. "Maybe you worth leaving," she said. She then put her back to me and went to her car. At the time, I had no idea what she meant by that. I watched her walk away and get into her car. After getting in, she seemed to sit there for a while, though I could not see what she was doing from the dark-tinted windows. "Everything all right, Katie-Ann?" I heard a familiar voice behind me. Turning around, I saw it was Mr. Bearden, standing at the entrance gate. "Yes, Mr. Bearden," I said automatically, as children do, and then I heard the sound of an engine grow to life. When I turned in the direction the sound came from, the woman's blue car was gone. I waited a little longer, chatting with Mr. Bearden a while, before walking home without ever stopping for anything. Like a reoccurring nightmare, I kept thinking about my encounter with the woman on the walk home, though in earnest I wanted to forget. It wasn't so much I wanted to forget as much as I just wish I hadn't seen her. I know it might sound like a very innocuous, albeit unsettling encounter, but I walked away feeling dirty, violated, like I'd done something wrong but couldn't explain what it was, and thus couldn't be forgiven. When I got home, I felt some compulsion to tell my mother. Not really a compulsion, more like that's what my head was dragging me to do, despite the dead weight in my stomach. Our flat was on top of a pub, across from a McDonald's restaurant. Some days the crowds beneath us were tipsy and benign. Some days they were neither of those things. On Fridays they'd be right drunk and rowdy. It was a little after 3 when I got to the steps with my keys out, so the pub was only filled with doughy, gray-bearded white men in their denim and flannel. Always they'd be peering out at me through the window for hardly a second before returning to their pints, like I was a sparrow passing by. When I opened the front door, I was greeted by Anne-Marie's screeching and Kayla's arguing over my mother's bludgeoning retorts. Mom was cooking supper, cradling baby Anne Mary, while deflecting Kayla's pleas to be allowed to go to a sleepover that included boys. Mom also scorned me for forgetting to take out the trash that morning. Other than that, the rest of the afternoon was pretty forgettable. I do remember that day that I felt an intense dislike for my mother. A hatred, in fact. I thought about how she'd never told me about my aunt and how she'd never invited her to see me or Kayla or even Anne Mary. She must be doing that against Father's wishes, I thought. She was his sister, not Mother's. I thought about how I really hated my mother then in a way that I'd never felt before, for being so stubborn. No wonder she was so prickly. I thought then about the woman. She's never been let to see me. I felt very sorry for the woman and wanted to see her again. There wasn't really time to tell my mother about what had happened. She had to keep an eye on Anne Mary and kept getting calls from her work. She was on maternity leave from the hospital, but the ladies who took over for her could never remember what from what, and either way, I didn't want to tell her. After all, it was my father's sister. I'd just wait for him to come back from his business trip to tell him the story. I remember the week was boring for a few days. Nothing too special at school or at home. Nothing except news that Father was coming home early from his business trip. I only found out about it from Kayla when I arrived from school, and she was the only one in the flat. Mother had taken Anne Marie with her to meet Father at the airport. I didn't understand this. Why wouldn't Mother just wait for Father at home, like all the other times? Kayla couldn't tell me because she hadn't paid attention or probably just wasn't told. Anyway, we took advantage of having the flat to ourselves. Daytime TV, music blaring in our room, crisps, soda, and chocolate chip cookies for dinner. At the time, I didn't make the connection to that woman, the one with the Jamaican accent. How could I? It wasn't until dark that my sister and I heard the front door lock jiggling open, and then the slow swish of the door across the carpet. Instinctively, Kayla and I walked over to the hallway to see them better and watch them take off their coats and shoes. My father was wearing his suit, the shoulders unrealistically pointed, his shirt collar withered around his neck, the tie undone and hanging in two. My mom stood beside him, one arm across his back, the hand gentling his shoulders, the other arm cradling Anne Mary. As though content in the confirmation it was them, Kayla walked away from the hall and back to her phone on the couch. I stayed, watching my father's slow movement, his face more drawn and haggard than I'd ever seen it. He walked in step with my mother as though they were both in a trance. Both grown-ups, giants beside me, took no notice of my presence before I spoke up in a little voice. "Father, I saw your sister." Father stopped. His expression was still the same, like he was asleep with eyes open, but then he looked down at me. "What?" he said. "I met my aunt, your sister." "What are you on about?" he said in a hoarse voice, his brow furrowing. I met your sister. She came to school last week on Thursday." My father just stared at me with his red-tinted yellow eyes. "Cadian," he deliberated, "what the blazes are you on about?" "Your sister," I said sharply. "She was a tall woman with dreadlocks, spoke in an accent. I think it was Jamaican or something, and she said she was your sister." There was a pause. My father's eyes didn't blink for what felt like a full minute. Then they grew, then they shrank, then turned to water. He put his large hands over his face. There was no sound. He stayed still that way. He looked like a weeping statue, save for his heaving shoulders. My mother tightened her arm around his torso. She looked at me, and I knew her face mirrored my own confusion. Then she whispered something into my father's ear and took Anne Mary with her into the spare room, the makeshift nursery. Sniffling, my father took his hands from his face, which was now damp and lined, wiped his nose with his sleeve, and knelt down beside me. "Cadian," he croaked in a trembling voice, "that wasn't your aunt. That woman's name was Danny Mulville, or Danny Bryce. She wasn't my sister. She was my wife, my first wife before I met your mother." He then proceeded to tell me about the long story of how they'd married back in Ghana when they were both only teenagers, and how father had decided to move to England to start a new life. The woman, Danny Bryce, had been born in Kingston, Jamaica, before moving there for high school, where she'd met my father. She didn't tell me at the time, but I would find out later that they never properly divorced. He had left 40 years ago and had never returned. It didn't take too long for Danny to eventually find us, since my mother posts everything online. Eventually, Danny stumbled upon our happy little family on the internet and figured out where we were living. The police also think she might have found us because of the website of my father's business, which includes a picture of my dad and the address of his store, which is not far from our flat. My father had actually been receiving threatening emails at work from some account he didn't recognize, as well as harassing phone calls from unlisted numbers. After what happened, he figured all of them were connected to her, probably. "The reason I had to cut my trip short," he said presently, "was because they found Danny's body yesterday in a car just 3 kilometers from your school. I had to identify her with your mom." What my father didn't tell me was that Danny was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. When they arrived at the morgue to identify her body, they were not just met by the coroner, but also a city homicide inspector and a patrolman. They said the handgun looked like it had been stored behind her shawl, as there was a holster strapped around her waist. I felt sick when I found that out. The gun must have been what she was reaching for when she decided instead to take out a cigarette that day in front of the school gate. Disturbingly, that wasn't all they found. Inside her car was a machete, a roll of duct tape, a bottle of chloroform, and a coil of laid rope. I'm quite certain now what would have happened to me had I gotten into that blue car, and I find it terrifying that she chose to come after me specifically. What I'll never know, however, was why she changed her mind. So quoth this raven. Thank you, my darlings, so very much for coming to listen today. I so appreciate it when you all come to listen to me. It means so much to me. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson.